In Maria Valtorta's writings, again the notebooks of 1943, on August the 20th, Jesus said the following: "There's been much too much speculation over the centuries, and not out of a good thirst and honest desire to remedy the insistent evil, but rather only out of futile curiosity regarding what John says in chapter 10 of the Apocalypse. But you should know, Maria, that I allow what may be useful to know to be known, and conceal what I find to be useful for you not to know." So Jesus is telling us he'll tell us some things, but he won't tell us other things. "You are too weak, poor children of mine, to know the proper names of the apocalyptic 7 thunders. My angel said to John, 'Seal what the 7 thunders have said, and do not write it down.' I say that it is not yet time for what is sealed to be opened. And if John did not write it down, I will not say it." Just to avoid you having to go to chapter 10 of the book of Revelation, of the Apocalypse, I'll just read it. Not the whole chapter, but part of it. From verse 1. "Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. He had a little scroll open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea, and his left foot on the land, and called out with a loud voice, like a lion roaring. When he called out, the 7 thunders sounded. And when the 7 thunders had sounded, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying, 'Seal up what the 7 thunders have said, and do not write it down.' And the angel who I'd seen standing on sea and land lifted up his right hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it, that there should be no more delay, but that in the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the 7th angel, the mystery of God, as he announced to his servants the prophets, should be fulfilled. It is not your lot to taste that horror, and therefore it only remains for you to pray for those who will have to undergo it, that strength will not fail in them, and they will not come to form part of the mob who, under the lash of the scourge, will not experience repentance and will curse God instead of imploring his help." And here's the key sentence here. "Many of these are already on the earth, and their seed will be 7 times 7 more demoniacal than they are." This phrase, that many of these are already on the earth, this is 1943. So if the people who will form part of the mob of those who under the lash will curse God, those who will have to undergo the horror of the 7 thunders, so in the times of the book of Revelation, the end times, some of them already on the earth, that means that end time period must come within their lifetimes. Now, of course, there are people already on the earth in 1943 who are 90 years old. So we don't say, therefore, it's going to come in the next 10 years because, they'll be dead, most people, by the time they're 100. Now, we have to say, what's the maximum period we could be talking about here? Well, if you take a a baby who's a year old then, who's alive in 1943, he was born in 1942. Nobody lives beyond 120. Pretty much. I don't know of anybody who's had that age ascribed to them. So we'd have to be saying that this event will be happening at the latest in around 2060. But actually, of course, that's the very latest. If we're being more reasonable, what's more probable is that there are some very young children alive at this time, August 1943, and the normal human lifetime pretty much won't go beyond 100. It's just a very, very few that go beyond that. They'll be, if you take 100 years from 1942, 43, 2042, 2043. And of course, they will have had children in the decades. If they're very young in the early 1940s, they'll start having kids in the 1960s and through the 70s, and they'll have children and so on. And these people will be even more demoniacal than the generation that's alive when Jesus is speaking in 1943. But it means that there's a real risk that we're going to enter the end times in our lifetime. So we have to take more seriously than anybody has ever had to take seriously before world conflicts, or conflicts which are regional but may mushroom into broader conflicts. And so when we look at what's going on in the Middle East and the great potential for it spreading out, we have to realise that a miscalculation or an escalation, and escalations are not likely to be controllable. There used to be the talk of this in American war planning, perhaps British war planning too. As if you can escalate gradually. They do this, you do that. They do this, you do that. And you could stop the escalation at a certain point. But given the speed of these weapons, if you read Annie Robinson's book from last year, Nuclear War, you'll see that when an intercontinental ballistic missile is launched from either Russia or from the United States, the other side might detect the burn when the launch happens from their satellite. From that point, from that moment of detection of the burn to the target being hit, either be the USA or be Russia, is about 30 minutes. So 30 minutes for all the decision making that needs to be made. That's though not the only key point. The next key point is when, because then the missile disappears over the horizon. You can't specify where it's going at this point. You have a rough idea. But it's only when it comes over the horizon that other instruments come into play to detect what this thing is and where it's heading. But that maybe leaves you with 15 minutes. It depends also where. That's an intercontinental ballistic missile launched from the continental USA or somewhere in Russia. But if you have a submarine launched nuclear missile, you don't have half an hour anymore. You may have 10 minutes, depending on where that submarine is, which launches. My point is here that once this thing starts, there's no time to de-escalate really. There's no time to call a halt, to say, look, we're going too far. You have to launch what you've got before the enemy's weapons hit yours and make it impossible to retaliate. So it means once the cycle begins, it ends only in total destruction of the human race, in every meaningful sense. Survivors there may be, but what will they be? How long will they last? There'll be nuclear winter. So crops will fail, there'll be mass starvation of those who aren't directly under the blast area, or the areas of radiation that's so powerful that will kill you instantly or within a few hours. That's the world we're heading for. A renegade Israel, because it is renegade. A United States that's under its control and therefore can't be relied upon to be reasonable. And a Russia which will react to provocations. Putin has already said a week ago he's looking at change in nuclear policy so that a nuclear weapon can be used against an adversary which is itself not a nuclear power, but which is in an alliance with a nuclear power. Thinking about Ukraine, we have engineered a coup in 2014 against the lawfully elected regime that was governing Ukraine. Yanukovych, I think it was. The guys who took over, created a new government, created a new state, were backed by the trained in the United States. They were our guys. I say ours, because Britain is, of course, the poodle of the United States now. So, these guys, they formed the new regime, obviously hostile to Russia. And a lot of people in Kiev and other parts of Ukraine were happy about that. They want to join NATO, they want to join the European Union. Problem is, there's a whole bunch of ethnic Russians in the east of Ukraine who weren't happy about that. So we have rebellion. And we find that the new regime in Kiev bans Russian as an official language of Ukraine. That's nice. That's going to calm everything down. And then this constant war of attrition by the Kiev regime with the people in eastern Ukraine goes on from 2014 through to 2022 when Russia invades. Its people, obviously, its troops were involved already. But you see what started this? Now, and we've been supplying these people, and the Brits want to say, oh, well, they must use our Storm Shadow missiles deep into Russian territory. Like, if a nuclear weapon hits the United States, 3 or 4, the United States could survive. Our little island's national territory is tiny, smaller than one United States state. If we're hit by 1 or 2 of these things, that's over. That's the history of the country that's gone back to St. Augustine coming here in about 537, probably not that date, in the 5th century, 6th century. Come here at the behest of Pope Gregory I. We have history before that with Roman rule. We have the rebellion against the Romans. We have a lot of history all over. Because our macho idiots in Whitehall think that we can face off with the Russians. Don't do that when it's a case of national annihilation. The Russians, though, are quite probably looking at changing their nuclear engagement policy because we are effectively standing in the shoes of the Ukrainians. There'd be no Ukrainian state, there'd be no Ukrainians fighting now if it weren't for us. No doubt British soldiers and American troops are on the ground anyway, French troops too, assisting with the complicated equipment that has been given to them. So we face another source of conflict, another expanding conflict potentially. And meanwhile, of course, Ukraine is devastated. But we never cared about that. We just had our own power play to play, just as Britain did in 1939, didn't care about Poland. We gave Poland to the Russians in 1945. These are games that big powers play, but little people, ordinary people, suffer for it. This is why one must be a patriot, but not thinking, oh, well, therefore, my government right or wrong. Your government can lead you to destruction. And we are in, it seems, according to the writing of Maria Valtorta, in the end times. Now, just in case I got that wrong, I got a book actually, perhaps the best book on Maria Valtorta's writing on the end times. It's this. L'ultima ora, l'apostasia, l'anticristo e la fine del mondo, negli scritti di Maria Valtorta. The last hour, the apostasy, the antichrist, and the end of the world in the writings of Maria Valtorta by Liberato De Caro, who is the author of several papers that look scientifically into the writings of this extraordinary woman. And you'll never find that on any other Catholic mystic. So I'm not saying don't waste your time on other mystics. Gosh, spend your time on those mystics. It's really worthwhile. In fact, there's one I've got to speak about. But when you're looking at something that's really more than anything that we've ever had in the last 2,000 years, really you've got to focus on the writings of Maria Valtorta. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because, and he's written many other things, I think other books as well, but in Italian, that's the problem. And my Italian's shaky, to say the least. I looked for a reference to this phrase. Repeats it. Many of these are already on the earth, and their seed will be 7 times 7 more demoniacal than they are. I don't think he quotes it in there. He passes over it. It's really frustrating. So I can't see what the great man has to say. It just seems plain on the face of it that we're getting close to a catastrophe, a cataclysm.